The architect of democracy. James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, was much more than a founder of the American nation. He was a visionary who deeply understood human nature and the eternal challenges of governance. Born in 1751 in Virginia, Madison grew up during a time of revolutionary transformation, yet his genius lay in his ability to think beyond the present moment. While many of his contemporaries focused on the urgencies of independence, Madison delved into the classics of political philosophy, studying ancient republics and modern monarchies, seeking to understand why some societies thrived while others disintegrated. His writings and thoughts, forged in the revolutionary experience of the 18th century, offer surprisingly relevant insights into our contemporary dilemmas. Madison was not just a theorist. He was a meticulous observer of human nature, recognizing both our capacity for virtue and our tendency towards corruption. This realistic understanding, far from being pessimistic, provided the foundation for enduring institutions that could channel both our best and worst instincts. Today, more than 2 centuries later, his advice resonates with renewed urgency in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. In an era of extreme political polarization, digital misinformation, and global crises, Madison's lessons on how to build resilient societies and responsible governments are not only relevant but essential for our democratic survival. He offers us a map to navigate modern complexity, based on timeless principles of power, freedom, and human responsibility. Lesson 1. The dangers of faction and the need for pluralism. Madison warned that the violence of faction represented the greatest danger to any republic. In his famous Federalist No. 10, he defined faction as a group of citizens united by common passions adverse to the rights of other citizens or the permanent interests of the community. For Madison, factions were inevitable in a free society. They were, in fact, the price of freedom. Trying to eliminate them would be like destroying the liberty which is essential to their existence, or giving all citizens the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. Madison's solution was ingenious: not to eliminate factions, but to control them through diversity and institutional structure. He argued that a large and diverse republic would be safer than a small and homogeneous one, because the multiplicity of interests would make it more difficult for any faction to dominate the others. Extend the sphere, he wrote, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Contemporary application. We live today in an era of extreme polarization, where social media algorithms amplify echo chambers and radicalize positions. Paradoxically, while Madison envisioned an expanded republic physically, we live in a digitally connected but intellectually fragmented world. Modern factions form online, creating parallel realities where different groups operate with completely distinct sets of facts. Madison would teach us that the answer is not to silence dissenting voices or create even more uniformity, but to cultivate a society where multiple perspectives can coexist and compete in the marketplace of ideas. This means actively resisting the temptation to consume only media that confirms our biases. Practically speaking, we can apply this principle by following journalists and commentators from different political spectrums, seeking primary sources instead of filtered interpretations, and regularly questioning our own assumptions. In our local communities, this translates into participating in diverse civic organizations, supporting events that bring together people from different backgrounds, and creating spaces for constructive discussion. In the workplace, it means valuing diversity of thought, not just demographic diversity, and encouraging respectful debates about strategies and decisions. Madison would remind us that the goal is not to eliminate conflict, but to make it productive and civilized. Lesson 2. The separation of powers as a safeguard of freedom. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, Madison wrote in Federalist No. 51, one of the most quoted phrases in American political theory. For him, the separation of powers was not merely a matter of administrative efficiency but a fundamental necessity derived from human nature. Madison understood that men were not angels. If they were, there would be no need for government at all. But since men govern other men, government must first be empowered to control the governed and then compelled to control itself. His genius lay in recognizing that personal virtue, though desirable, was not a reliable safeguard against the abuse of power. Instead, he designed a system where the very institutional structure would create incentives for responsible behavior. Each branch of government would have not only distinct powers but also the means and motives to resist encroachments from the other branches. Experience has assured mankind that the necessity of auxiliary precautions against the government, he observed, was fundamental to preserving freedom. Madison also understood that the separation of powers did not mean total isolation. The powers were separated but not hermetically sealed. Through checks and balances, each branch would have some degree of influence over the others, creating a dynamic tension that would prevent anyone from becoming dominant. This was a significant innovation, as many previous theories of separation of powers envisioned more rigid and absolute divisions. Contemporary application. This principle transcends the governmental sphere and applies to any human organization where power exists and the potential for abuse is present. In our professional lives, we can apply Madison's lesson by implementing transparency and accountability systems that do not rely solely on individual goodwill. This means creating decision-making processes that involve multiple perspectives, establishing auditing and feedback mechanisms, and ensuring that important information is accessible to different levels of the organization. In the modern business context, this translates into independent boards of directors, robust audit committees, and compliance systems that operate independently of executive management. For entrepreneurs and leaders of small organizations, it means creating structures that outlast their own leadership, documenting processes and decisions, and actively seeking feedback and external oversight. In our personal lives, we can apply this principle by avoiding excessive concentration of power in our relationships, be it with romantic partners, friends, or family. This means maintaining our financial, emotional, and intellectual independence, diversifying our sources of support and advice, and creating personal accountability systems, such as accountability groups, mentors, or even habit-tracking apps, that help us keep our commitments to ourselves. Lesson 3. The importance of knowledge and education. Madison was a fervent advocate of public education, believing that a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. This was not just a catchy phrase. Madison invested significantly of his own time and resources in education, including founding the University of Virginia alongside Thomas Jefferson. He viewed ignorance as freedom's greatest enemy and considered education not just an individual right, but a fundamental necessity for the survival of democracy. For Madison, education was not merely technical or vocational, but deeply civic. He believed that citizens needed to understand not just their own professions, but also the principles of government, the rights and duties of citizenship, and the history of free societies. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, he wrote, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. Madison also recognized that education should be continuous and adaptable. He himself was a lifelong student, maintaining extensive correspondence with intellectuals of his time and constantly revising his own positions in light of new evidence and experiences. His personal library contained thousands of volumes on history, philosophy, law, and science, and he regarded reading and study as fundamental civic duties. Contemporary application. In the information age, we paradoxically face an unprecedented crisis of misinformation. Madison would remind us that our individual responsibility to educate ourselves is even more critical today when anyone can publish information and when algorithms can amplify both truths and lies. Modern education should include not just factual knowledge but also media literacy, critical thinking, and the ability to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. This means developing the habit of fact-checking information before sharing it, seeking primary sources instead of second-hand accounts, and maintaining a healthy skepticism toward extraordinary claims. Practically, we can apply this lesson by dedicating regular time to structured learning, not just passively consuming content but actively engaging with complex ideas through reading, courses, discussions, and reflection. Continuous education also means being willing to change our minds when presented with compelling evidence. Madison would teach us that true education is not about accumulating knowledge like a treasure, but about developing the ability to think clearly and adapt to new circumstances. This requires intellectual humility, the readiness to admit when we do not know something and seek help from experts when necessary. In the professional context, this translates into investing in ongoing development, staying updated with developments in our field, and seeking regular mentorship and feedback. Personally, it means cultivating intellectual curiosity, asking questions, and seeing every experience as a learning opportunity. Lesson 4. The virtue of moderation and compromise. Unlike some of his more revolutionary contemporaries, Madison deeply believed in the art of compromise and moderation as essential political virtues. He did not see compromise as a weakness or capitulation, but as a practical necessity in any diverse society. His approach was pragmatic without being opportunistic. He held firm principles but recognized that implementing those principles often required flexibility and patience. The very American Constitution is a monument to Madisonian compromise. During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Madison initially favored a much stronger national government, but when it became clear that such a proposal would not garner enough support, he adjusted his position. The final result was not exactly what he had envisioned, but it was something that could work and be accepted by a sufficient majority of states. Madison also understood that effective compromise required all parties to concede something significant. He was willing to accept concessions on issues he deemed important, as long as fundamental principles were preserved. His philosophy was that an imperfect agreement that could be implemented was preferable to a perfect agreement that would remain only on paper. Contemporary application. In an increasingly polarized culture, where extreme positions are often viewed as more authentic or morally superior, Madison's moderation offers a powerful and necessary alternative. This does not mean the absence of principles or moral relativism, but rather the wisdom to recognize that sustainable and lasting solutions often emerge from genuine dialogue and the pursuit of common ground. In our personal relationships, this translates into practicing active listening, not just waiting for our turn to speak, but genuinely trying to understand the perspectives and concerns of others. It means being willing to acknowledge when our opponents have valid points and incorporating those insights into our own thinking. Moderation also requires us to develop tolerance for ambiguity and complexity, resisting the temptation to oversimplify multifaceted issues. In the professional environment, Madison's moderation manifests in our ability to build coalitions and find solutions that different stakeholders can support. This requires negotiation skills, empathy, and the ability to separate people from positions, attacking problems, not personalities. It also means being willing to implement solutions gradually, recognizing that sustainable changes often happen incrementally. Moderation is not passivity. It requires the courage to resist the pressure from extreme groups and the wisdom to navigate diverse demands. Madison would teach us that true leadership often involves finding the middle ground between extremes while maintaining fundamental principles while remaining flexible about methods and timing. Lesson 5. Constant vigilance as the price of freedom. Madison understood deeply that freedom was not a natural state that, once achieved, would maintain itself automatically. Rather, he viewed freedom as something that must be constantly defended, cultivated, and renewed. His understanding of human nature led him to believe that those in power would naturally seek to expand that power, while those outside of power often became complacent or apathetic. This dynamic meant that citizen vigilance was not only desirable but absolutely essential for preserving freedom. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, although often attributed to Madison, perfectly captures his thought. He believed that citizens had the perpetual responsibility to watch their representatives and institutions, remaining engaged in the democratic process even when it became inconvenient, tedious, or uncomfortable. For Madison, democracy was not a spectacle to be watched but a process to be actively lived. Madison also recognized that effective vigilance required more than just paying attention. It required knowledge, organization, and the courage to act when necessary. He regarded a free press as fundamental to this vigilance, providing information that would allow citizens to make informed judgments. But he also understood that the ultimate responsibility lay with the citizens themselves, who should use that information to hold their representatives accountable. Contemporary application. This lesson applies to both our civic and personal lives, and perhaps is more relevant today than ever. In an era of rapid change and complex systems, the temptation to let experts or other people take care of important issues is greater than ever. But Madison would remind us that this abdication of responsibility is precisely how freedoms are gradually lost. In the civic sphere, this means staying informed about local and national political issues, not just during election times, but consistently. It means reading beyond the headlines, understanding the nuances of public policy, and contacting representatives when necessary. It also means participating in civic organizations, attending public meetings, and being willing to engage in issues that affect our community, even when it requires significant time and effort. In our personal lives, constant vigilance means being aware of our own tendencies towards conformity, intellectual laziness, or abdication of responsibility. This includes monitoring our own media consumption habits, regularly questioning our own assumptions, and being willing to stand up for our principles even when it is socially inconvenient. Personal vigilance also extends to our relationships and commitments. It means paying attention to the small signals that something is not working well, whether in relationships, work, or health, and taking proactive measures before small problems turn into major crises. Madison would teach us that personal freedom, like political freedom, requires constant maintenance and careful attention. Lesson 6. The importance of experience and reflection. Madison was a meticulous scholar of history and a careful observer of human nature. Unlike many political theorists who base their ideas on abstract principles or imaginary utopias, Madison grounded his thinking in a rigorous analysis of what had actually worked and failed in other societies throughout history. He extensively studied ancient republics, European confederations, and the political experiments of his own time, extracting practical lessons from each. His approach was both empirical and pragmatic. He was not satisfied with elegant theories that sounded good on paper. He wanted to know how ideas worked in practice, with real people in real circumstances. This methodology led him to conclusions that often contradicted the conventional wisdom of his time. For example, while many ancient thinkers believed that republics could only function in small homogeneous communities, Madison argued that large and diverse republics would be more stable. Madison also practiced constant reflection on his own experiences and decisions. His writings show a man willing to revise his positions when confronted with new evidence, but also someone who systematically learned from his mistakes and successes. He maintained extensive correspondence with other thinkers, always testing his ideas against experience and the judgment of others. Contemporary application. In a world that values speed, constant innovation, and quick fixes, Madison reminds us of the irreplaceable value of careful reflection and learning from experience. This is especially relevant in an era of information overload, where the pressure to have immediate opinions on complex issues can lead us to hasty and ill-informed judgments. Madison's lesson on experience and reflection invites us to develop the habit of regular and systematic self-reflection. This might mean keeping a journal where we record not just events, but also our thoughts and reactions to those events. It means setting aside regular time to analyze our decisions, identify patterns in our behavior, and extract lessons that can inform future choices. In the professional context, this translates into practices such as post-project reviews, where we examine not just outcomes, but also processes and decisions that led to those outcomes. It means seeking honest feedback from peers and supervisors, and being willing to adjust our approach based on that feedback. It also means valuing the experience of mentors and more experienced colleagues, recognizing that wisdom often comes from applying knowledge over time. Madison's reflection also encourages us to study history and learn from the experiences of other people and societies. In a rapidly changing era, it can be tempting to assume that past experiences are irrelevant, but Madison would remind us that fundamental human nature remains remarkably consistent over time. Patterns that repeat in history can provide us with valuable insights into contemporary challenges. Finally, Madison would teach us that true wisdom comes not just from accumulating experiences but from processing them reflectively. This requires patience, humility, and the willingness to recognize that our understanding is always evolving. It means being open to changes in perspective and willing to admit when we were wrong, viewing those moments not as failures but as opportunities for growth. The living legacy of Madison. James Madison offers us much more than political advice. He presents us with a complete philosophy of life, based on a deep and nuanced understanding of human nature, a valuing of knowledge as a tool of freedom, and a constant pursuit of balance between lofty ideals and practical realities. His teachings remind us that democracy and liberty are not guaranteed by documents or institutions, but are living achievements that must be renewed, defended, and refined with each generation. What makes Madison particularly relevant to our times is his ability to combine optimism about human potential with realism about human limitations. He was neither a utopian who ignored human flaws nor a cynic who gave up on the possibility of progress. Instead, he offered a third way, the possibility of creating institutions and practices that would channel both our noble impulses and our less noble ones in constructive directions. In these days, as we face challenges that Madison could never have imagined, from artificial intelligence to climate change, globalization to social media, his fundamental principles remain surprisingly relevant. Perhaps the most important lesson is that wisdom is not in having all the answers but in asking the right questions, keeping an open mind to contradictory evidence, and never ceasing to learn and adapt. Madison shows us that greatness lies not in avoiding mistakes but in learning from them. It does not lie in absolute certainty, but in navigating uncertainty with solid principles. It does not lie in avoiding conflict, but in making it productive. He teaches us that democracy is both an ideal to be pursued and a practice to be perfected, and that our responsibility as citizens is to actively participate in this ongoing process of improvement. As Madison himself said, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. This statement, written over 2 centuries ago, echoes with renewed urgency in our era of digital and global transformation. Madison's invitation is clear and timeless. Let us be perpetual students of life, vigilant citizens of our democracy, and patient builders of a future that honors both our individual freedom and our collective responsibility to future generations. His legacy is not just a set of ideas, but an example of how to live with intellectual curiosity, moral courage, and practical humility. In a world that often seems fragmented between extremes, Madison offers us a middle path that is not a compromise of principles, but practical wisdom, the art of holding lofty ideals while working patiently to make them a reality in the imperfect world we live in.